Tonight, Fort Drum is the largest economic driver in the North Country. Its footprint grew slightly in 2024. 7 News reporter Lexi Bruning dives into the numbers from an annual report released today.
Fort Drum generated $2.56 billion of economic activity for the North Country region in 2024, slightly higher than the $2.54 billion from the previous year. That's according to Advocate Drum's Fort Drum Economic Impact Report.
I think this report is super important for the community to truly understand the importance of Fort Drum to our community, and the fact that Fort Drum is interwoven or synced with the North Country in so many different ways.
According to Fort Drum's economic impact statement, the direct economic impact on the region is $1.9 billion, a 1.3% increase from 2023. The report attributes that increase to federal aid to local schools and cost of living adjustments. $665 million in indirect spending makes up the rest of Advocate Drum's $2.56 billion number.
It would be all the ancillary services that happen outside of Fort Drum that support Fort Drum, or because of Fort Drum that were created, whether that's in education, whether that's in healthcare.
More than 21,000 jobs within the Tri-County region supported directly and indirectly by Fort Drum accounted for about 1/5 of the region's wage earners, making Fort Drum the largest single-site employer in New York State last year.
New York's a big state, and there's a lot of big employers that are headquartered in New York State, but Fort Drum right here in Jefferson County is the largest employer in the state.
Still, that 21,000 number is down from last year's 24,000 jobs. McFadden attributes some of that to soldiers leaving or transferring towards the end of the fiscal year.
What happens typically post-deployment is you'll see a significant number of soldiers who will end up leaving the unit and the post to go to schools and permanent changes of station, things that were delayed because they were deployed.
Healthcare and social services, educational services, and construction are among the top 3 industries that indirectly benefited from Fort Drum in 2024.
They're integral to our community, not only in terms of our culture, our friends, our family, our workforce, but also our economy.
Retirees in the region remained about the same in 2024 as in 2023, around 15,800. Lexi Bruning, 7 News.